The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll introduce you to the host of TVO's new original series, Big, If True. Up first, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will unpack the NDP's new deal for municipalities. OnPoli is next. Hey, partner.
Oh, sir.
Here we are again.
Yes, yes.
Those watching on video, as opposed to listening on podcast, will notice that we are wearing... These are not Star Trek communications devices. No, actually, no.
I would love one of those.
Wouldn't that be cool? These are splashes of ink because they represent a group called Ink-Stained Wretches, which is what they used to call journalists back in the day before we started typing all our copy on computers. And they are all about promoting reliable local journalism that is essential for a healthy democracy.
Yes. If people want to know more about this effort, you can check out their website at ink-stainedwretches.org.
Yeah. Are you an ink-stained wretch?
I've called myself a pixel monger because I never actually worked in ink or print. Have only ever been behind a laptop screen.
I've got that on you then, pal.
Yes.
I used to work in ink. Yes, indeed. This is kind of neat. I feel a bit like Jean-Luc Picard here. I'm just going to tap this and see if it'll...
I do like it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It also brings to mind Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, had a different name for the press and reporters. When he left office, he called us all a bunch of feral beasts, I believe.
Feral beasts?
Yes.
Also accurate. One other item before we dive in, and that is that the guy who produces this program, this OnPoli podcast, Matthew O'Meara, tells me that you almost gave him a heart attack last week as it related to election timing. What did you say to traumatize that poor fellow?
So the background here is that there was a previously unannounced press conference by the Premier on Wednesday morning after question period wrapped up at the legislature. And under Ontario law, writs of election can only be issued on a Wednesday. And so a previously unannounced press conference for the Premier, I wanted to warn Matthew that something was happening. We might have needed to cover it on the podcast. We are not going to, in fact, in the event. But I just said, look, there's a small outside chance that the election is starting. And then I did the math, double checked, and no, wait. 5 Thursdays from yesterday would have meant voting on Boxing Day. So very quickly,
not a chance.
Determined, no, it's not going to happen. Everybody can calm down. But I probably should just not have mentioned it in the first place.
You should not. He has not been the same since. I don't want to say he almost wet his pants, but I mean, he was in big trouble.
A few more gray hair. I said,
yeah, I think so.
And he's a young guy, too.
All right, let's get out of here. Off to issue 1. The Ontario New Democratic Party unveiled its so-called New Deal for Ontario municipalities this week. The gist of it is, if the NDP wins the next election, these are the changes they would implement to give municipalities a better shot at providing what they say are much-needed public services. Most of these ideas, you won't be surprised to hear, reverse policies the current government has introduced over the past 6 years. JMM, you were at the announcement, so let's have some of the deets, if you may.
Yeah, so just a bit of context here. The province creates municipalities to do lots of local services in these communities, gives them these jobs, requires them to do them, and then does not always give them money or the means to raise the money to do them. And so the fundamental problem here from the municipalities' perspective is they can't do the jobs that they are being asked to do. So NDP leader Marit Stiles has proposed with a new deal that she would take, if she were the Premier, she would take these responsibilities out of municipal hands, either fully funding them from the provincial level or perhaps just delivering those services provincially directly. The motion that was proposed, I think, let me put this charitably, is thematic. It is not super detailed technically, but some of the policies that she did mention specifically were taking over provincial responsibility for affordable housing and homelessness prevention programs, public health, restoring cost sharing for things like public transit and ambulance services. It is kind of an odd quirk that ambulance service is kind of like a keystone healthcare function, and yet it is funded and operated by municipalities. There is some cost sharing. Municipalities say it is not enough. Those are the kinds of things that she mentioned. There are all sorts of long-standing complaints from municipalities that do include some changes made by this government, but honestly, some of them go back to the Mike Harris government and the Common Sense Revolution.
If I understand this, there are sort of, and you can help me on this,
Yeah.
there's hard services and soft services that municipalities offer. Municipalities like to offer the hard services, pick up the garbage, fix the potholes, water, sewer, that kind of stuff. The softer services, which the budgets skyrocket when the economy goes south, welfare, affordable housing, that kind of stuff. They can't plan for that. They don't have the money for that. And yet the province has been telling them increasingly that's the stuff they got to do.
Yeah, so the root cause here is that municipalities almost exclusively have to rely on either property taxes or user fees to bring money in. And the property tax has some virtues, particularly for local governments, but at best it tends to lag economic development. And then you get into a situation where you have a recession and suddenly there's a lot more people who need your help, but there's no more money coming in. And unlike the provincial and federal governments, municipalities are forbidden from running deficits. So it puts them in a real bind.
A couple of days ago, Marit Stiles, the NDP leader, introduced a familiar face at a news conference at Queen's Park who will be her special advisor on this file. Why don't we hear from both of them right now?
We know that municipalities want a new deal. Every municipality in this province is struggling. And let's be clear, it's the people. It's the residents of those towns and cities that are struggling the most. We need to bring back some transparency. We need to bring back some accountability. And we need the province to actually be a real partner with our municipalities.
The provincial-local government relationship is broken, and it needs to be fixed. And this isn't just my call. It's not just the call of the provincial NDP. It's also the call of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. And we hear it every day from mayors and councils across this province.
I'm sure many of you, either watching or listening, will recognize the sight and or voice of David Miller, the former mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010, who made actually several other interesting observations at this news conference. He noticed how a lot of infrastructure seems to get built in a locality in the lead up to a by-election. That is not inaccurate. He called for predictable, stable, long-term funding for municipalities, just for the reasons we talked about a second ago, so they can plan properly years into advance. He suggested the province end its interference in purely local matters. Can you spell bike lanes? I think that's what he was referring to there. He pointed out that when he was the mayor, other orders of government cooperated quite nicely with cities and towns across the province. For example, Dalton McGuinty, when he was premier, his government passed the City of Toronto Act, which gave the capital city a lot more powers to organize its affairs. The federal government, under Prime Minister Paul Martin, also established a seat at the cabinet table responsible for urban affairs. John Godfrey, who used to host a show here 35 or more years ago, he was the minister responsible. There was more cooperation between the feds and the municipalities back then. The point being, this has been done, this can be done, but in the view of David Miller, the Ford government is not doing it.
My journalism career began when Miller was still mayor of Toronto, and one of the first things I ever heard him say in Toronto's council chambers, referring to the Liberal government under Dalton McGuinty back then, says something to the effect of, Queen's Park is happy to give us money to build transit, but they haven't given us the money to run it yet. And I think that is a really nice summation of the problem that municipalities face. Obviously, that was referring to the specific transit agreements back then, but it is a continuing problem that building a thing and operating a thing are different. They require different sources of revenue, and municipalities are still struggling with that basic problem 15 years later.
Build, operate, maintain.
Yes.
All things that are problematic.
And the maintenance thing is going to become harder because of climate change, but that's a whole other issue.
Now, you, as I say, you're at the Newser, right? So
yes.
Did you get a question in, or what did you want to know?
I did. The most basic question I think, any reporter could ask when a public official is proposing changes in spending, right? How much would this cost?
And did they tell you?
Not exactly. The NDP have not formally costed this out in the sense that you would see with an election campaign document. In those documents, you get like something close to a spreadsheet of costs and revenues. But the NDP can point to work done by, for example, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. They have estimated that Ontario's cities and towns are spending something like $4 billion on areas that are provincial responsibilities, in particular areas that are handled by the provinces in other provinces outside of Ontario.
Now, I remember covering the Bill Davis government back in he was in power in the 1970s. I didn't cover them then. I covered him when he was in the 1980s. And one of the things that he was really good at was railing against opposition criticism and then liberally stealing their ideas whenever he wanted to. And he was very
Small
good.
L liberal.
Small L liberal, that's right. He was happy to steal a good idea from the other side and then take credit for it. Is there anything in this package here you can imagine the Ford government stealing and taking credit for?
To some extent, Doug Ford already has stolen some ideas. He has, in fact, cut new deals with the cities of Toronto and Ottawa. Those new deals are very sort of city-specific agreements, and they don't address the fundamental imbalance that we've been talking about here. Doing so would be very expensive, as we say. Like $4 billion is a plausible estimate. It could go higher depending on how ambitious you want to be. I think it is unlikely that the Tories would be in a hurry to add that kind of a big, permanent, ongoing spending commitment to the provincial treasury. I mean, from their perspective, they're very likely to be able to announce a balanced budget in the spring. The current system may not be working for a lot of people, but it's working for the current provincial government.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. The mayor of Mississauga, Carolyn Parish, has found herself in hot water after she made some disgraceful comments comparing the recently killed Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, to former South African President Nelson Mandela. Sinwar was the architect behind the October 7th attacks on, among others, people attending a music festival in Israel. That attack resulted in the murders of more than 1,200 people. The mayor's support for a vigil for Sinwar to take place in Mississauga's City Hall Square, called Celebration Square, also struck many people as inappropriate, as was the poster design promoting the event, which included the phrase, "Lest we forget," and the depiction of poppies. Now, those are normally reserved for Canadian military veterans, not representatives of groups classified as terrorists by the Canadian government.
Jewish community leaders had hoped that the mayor would intervene to stop the event. This is being held on municipal property that the city could, at least in theory, obstruct. She did not, on the grounds that the event was taking place, and so long as it was lawful, it could go ahead. On the mayor's Nelson Mandela comparison, she said that during a city council meeting and remarked that your terrorist and somebody else's terrorist may be two different things.
That's not necessarily wrong, but the government of Canada at the moment considers Hamas a terrorist group, and the government in waiting, as the Conservatives would like to be thought of, would also hold the same view about that. So we are where we are.
Not a lot of disagreement there.
Correct. Other observers dug into Parish's X/Twitter feed and noted that for a Canadian politician, she has spent a lot of time and had a lot to say about the Middle East for a very long time. And in case it's not obvious, she's very pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli, which is perfectly fine. People are entitled to believe whatever they want to believe.
Absolutely.
But the Mandela comments seem particularly bizarre. Historians would tell you Nelson Mandela spent almost 30 years in jail in South Africa trying to end apartheid. He did not plot terrorist attacks against women and children attending music festivals. After he got out of jail, Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister at the time, made him an honorary citizen of Canada, something I doubt is in the offing for the slain Hamas leader. At a press conference in Mississauga earlier this week, Premier Ford praised Carolyn Parish, saying she's doing a great job, which is an odd thing for the Premier to say, since sources have told me, A, he doesn't believe it, and B, he's been one of the strongest leaders in the country condemning anti-Semitism. So why he'd go to bat for Carolyn Parish, whose comments in the past have often been criticized for bordering on anti-Semitism, it's a bit perplexing to many.
There was another incident in Ottawa along these kinds of lines. At Ottawa Carleton High School was holding a Remembrance Day ceremony earlier this month where the song Haza Salam was played. The song title in Arabic means roughly "This is Peace," which is a fine enough sentiment for Remembrance Day, but it is also associated with the Palestinian movement, and both the Jewish Federation of Ottawa and the local MPP, Lisa MacLeod, objected to a Remembrance Day ceremony seeming to take a political political stand on current events in the Middle East. The principal has subsequently apologized to parents, and the school board is apparently looking into it.
You know, you could never go wrong just singing "O Canada" at a school in the morning.
Yeah, oh Canada, read in Flanders Fields, and like you're at least not going to rock the boat.
And with that, we're off to issue 3. Let's talk nukes. Nuclear reactors produce nuclear waste, which needs to be stored somewhere safe because it tends to be very radioactive and hang around for about 10,000 years. Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick have a plan for long-term storage. But the problem has been finding a community willing to have a nuclear waste repository placed anywhere near it, even deep underground. There are, however, a few contenders for this site, yes?
Yes. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is a federal agency, has been working for years now to work with cities or towns who are willing to host this site. The positive from their point of view is that there's potentially some money involved here. But you probably don't need to spell out what the cons of hosting this kind of facility would be. Like, people are nervous about this stuff. The list has been narrowed down to basically 2 places, either in northwestern Ontario, outside of the town of Ignace, or in southern Ontario, in the Bruce Peninsula, the municipality of South Bruce. They have both voted to at least show their support for being host communities.
I'm guessing, the Bruce site makes a lot of sense given that the Bruce nuclear reactors are right there and you don't have to transport the stuff very far to do it. But we're not talking, obviously, about digging a hole in the ground and just putting it in there. This is specialized, expensive work that we're talking.
Yes, so the facility will be as deep as the CN Tower is tall,
Amazing.
about 500 meters deep underground. Will cost about $26 billion to develop. That is not actually tax money. Incidentally, this is money that the government has been collecting from electricity charges. So functionally, your electricity bill has helped pay for this facility over the last many years. At the moment, spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear power plants that are almost all in Ontario functionally, they are kept on site at the generating stations. And I actually toured the Bruce nuclear station a few years ago. I've seen where they store these fuel casks, and they're these giant white containers. That's after they spend a year cooling off in a giant pool of water. They are designed, those what they call dry casks, they are designed to last decades, like 50 years or more. Decades are not enough because this stuff is potentially hazardous to human health for thousands and thousands of years. So you need a longer strategy. This very deep hole we are talking about, the deep geological repository, is part of a longer-term strategy for the nuclear waste.
Any guesses at all as to when it might be up, built, and ready to go?
Well, first, the NWMO actually has to pick which community it is going to build in. And from a political perspective, they at least now have the advantage that there are actually 2 communities who both want it. And if it just narrowed down to one, things get dicey because somebody can walk away and then you've got to start from scratch. With 2 communities, the NWMO has a bit more flexibility. They are supposed to make that choice, I believe, either, at this point, I guess it has to be next year. To give you a sense of how long other facilities have taken, there was a similar facility in Finland. They began construction in 2004. It opened just this year. So a 20-year construction timeline is like a reasonable guesstimate here. We still don't know which community the NWMO will choose, but when they do, it will at least start the clock on when construction might actually begin. But, you're talking realistically, construction would begin at least several years from now, and then it will continue to operate for 20 years or more. And that is partly why these communities are interested in it, right? They're interested in the money that will be spent in their communities, the construction jobs, those kinds of things.
Will this be done in my lifetime? That's what I want to know.
Well, yes. Well,
as long as I live to be 120.
Well, so the question is not just will this one be done, because we might need a second one.
Oh, boy.
The NWMO's, all of its planning, at least in the last time I spoke with them in any detail, all of their planning was just about building a, what they call a DGR, Deep Geological Repository. They want to build a DGR big enough to handle the amount of waste we currently have from the nuclear reactors that were operating until about like 2015 or so. As you may have noticed, we've discussed it on the podcast, the Ontario government wants to extend the lifespan of its current reactors and build more at places like Darlington and Bruce. So there are decades more of nuclear fuel coming that we don't currently know. Like maybe we have to upsize this current DGR. Maybe we have to build a second one. We don't know yet.
So will this be done in my lifetime? Definitely maybe.
Yes, exactly.
And with that, let's go talk columns. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I chat about the columns we wrote for the TVO website over the past week. Get us started, if you would.
So I am going to return to this idea of a new deal for cities that Marit Stiles proposed, and we talked about at the top of the episode. And I wrote for TVO asking, what would Queen's Park ask cities to give up in exchange for this new deal? It's not just the NDP talking about the need for a new deal. Bonnie Crombie talked on our show about how she might write the fiscal structure of municipalities. But before we get to that, I do want to emphasize a point that the mayor of Zora Township told me on Monday. This is Marcus Ryan. He basically, whatever you think should come next, the current system is not working. He just had this way of asking, like how's the current system working for you, right? He's the mayor of a smaller town, but like they've got lots of big city problems too, right? In Oxford County, they've got people sleeping under bridges. They've got homeless encampments. They've got needles in parks. If you think that is just a Toronto problem or just an Ottawa problem, you are incorrect.
Let me jump in. I got to confess, I've never heard of Zora Township. Is that in Oxford County?
Yes,
it is.
Okay. I believe he's the warden of Oxford County and also the mayor of Zora Township.
Okay.
And apologies to the mayor if I've gotten one of his titles wrong.
Very good. Okay. Live and learn.
To the mayor's point, just fixing the current problem, you could argue that actually should be enough. But I think you and I both know that when Queen's Park does these kinds of things, it's not purely out of the beneficence and goodness of its heart. There are strings attached. And, there are lots of ideas about, like, what do we want municipalities do to help fix the housing crisis, for example. I mentioned climate change and infrastructure maintenance earlier in the podcast. Taking this huge fiscal burden off of municipalities does give Queen's Park some room to say, well, and while we're doing this, here's what we would like you to do. And in the column, I discuss some ideas for what Queen's Park might ask.
Gotcha.
And how about you, Steve?
One of the very nice things about this gig is that they don't make me write about politics every single week. Every now and then I'm allowed to stray, and I strayed this week. And, the Leafs are on my brain a lot these days. Partly because our captain's over in Germany apparently having his back looked at or something. And partly because, there was a lovely game the other night, which I'm sure you didn't watch, where the Leafs shut out the former Stanley Cup
My mental
champion.
health cannot stand becoming a Leafs fan.
You got enough problems as it is. I hear you. Anyway, great victory, shutout victory over the Golden Knights the other day. Reminded me that I wanted to do something about hockey. And so I wrote about a visit I had several months ago with a guy who has something that no player who has worn a Maple Leaf jersey for the last 57 years has got, and that is a Stanley Cup ring. And in fact, to those of us of a certain generation, this name will mean something. Dick Duff is who I want to talk about for a second. Dick Duff is now 88 years old. He lives in Mississauga, had a lot of good years with the Leafs. He won 2 Stanley Cups with the Leafs. Yes, he won 4 with the Montreal Canadiens, but we don't have to talk about that right now. Tony, behind camera 2, I don't want to talk about that right now. How's this for amazing? Sheldon, you want to bring the map up here? He is from Kirkland Lake, Ontario. That's where the red dot is. Kirkland Lake, Ontario is 6.5 hours from Ottawa. It's 6.5 hours from Toronto. And if you can imagine this, Dick Duff won 6 Stanley Cups in his career. His neighbor on one street in Kirkland Lake was a guy named Ralph Backstrom. Guess how many Stanley Cups Ralph won? 6.
Okay.
And then he moved, and he had another neighbor in Kirkland Lake by the name of Larry Hillman. Guess how many Stanley Cups Larry Hillman won?
So I'm sensing a theme.
6. So 18 Stanley Cups among 3 guys who lived in this small town in northern Ontario. It's really quite amazing. It's quite phenomenal. Now, Sheldon, let's go through the pictures here if we can. We're going to scroll through. There's Dick Duff today, 88 years old, God bless him, holding a picture of himself when he was a young hockey player for St. Michael's College School here in Toronto. Let's see the next picture after that. Here he is. Now, this is one of his Stanley Cup victories, and there he is at the right of the shot. I think that's Alan Stanley in the middle, and that's actually an autographed picture from Bill Barilko in the bottom left. Barilko was the guy who scored the overtime winning goal, I still think the most important playoff goal in Maple Leaf history, to win a Stanley Cup in 51, and then the Leafs didn't win another Stanley Cup for 11 years. Duff was on the team that helped break that curse. Let's see the next picture after this. This was a few years ago when that 67 Stanley Cup winning team, and remember, that's the last time the Leafs won the Stanley Cup, 67, came back and were feted at the Air Canada Centre, as it was then called, I think. Dick Duff on the right, Davy Keon. Oh, God bless him, Davy Keon. We love him, former captain of the team, on the left. And you know what? There's Dick Duff on the right in this shot, and look who's on the left, Pierre Trudeau. So he did sort of dabble in politics every now and then, and this is Trudeau and Duff at some event in Montreal. I'm sure Dick Duff was with the Canadians at the time when that picture was taken. So there we go. And we talked about hockey back then. We talked about hockey today. We had a really nice visit, and it was a great break from politics. So I was thrilled to be able to enjoy that. Before we go to the mailbag,
Right.
I want to say one more thing. I want to give a shout out to somebody named Brooke Hunter. Brooke Hunter is a woman who approached me at a Toronto Insurance Council conference a couple of weeks ago, and guess what she asked me?
Do you like your insurance provider?
We talked about that later. But the first thing she said to me was, "Hey, Steve, where's JMM?" Now, somehow I managed to exist in this business for a good 40 years before everybody started asking me about you. And now I can't go anywhere without people asking me about you. What is with that anyway?
I have no good answer to this. I don't consider myself particularly charismatic, but here we are.
I hate to tell you, pal, you got a bit of profile out there.
I'm grateful for the opportunity.
There you go. All right. Let's go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we are always delighted when you send it to onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got this week?
We have a question here from listener Gina Giorgio, who asks, "Good evening. I'm fairly new to following politics. Your show has been very informative. I'm a yearly donor and look forward to all future programming."
Great.
Stephen Lecce, Minister of Energy and Electrification, studied at the University of Western Ontario, getting a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. Sylvia Jones studied at Fanshawe College with a diploma in radio broadcasting. How are ministers chosen? I would think with such high-profile positions, they should have the best qualifications and education for the ministry they are chosen for. Thank you so much, Gina Giorgio.
Gina, this is a great question, and the conclusion you come to is absolutely wrong. And I'm not criticizing you here, but things have changed. There used to be a time in the province of Ontario where if you wanted to be the Minister of Health, you had to be a doctor. The Attorney General used to be always a very high-profile lawyer. The Finance Minister had to be a Bay Street executive. And over the years, all that has changed. You pointed out, Gina, in your note, Sylvia Jones has no background in healthcare at all. She is the health minister. Attorney General, it has gone from constitutional experts who have argued cases before the Supreme Court. I think of Ian Scott, I think of Roy McMurtry, I think of Michael Bryant, to the current Attorney General, Doug Downey, who was a real estate lawyer from Orillia. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not being critical. I'm just indicating it's now different. Let's look federally. The finance minister always was a Bay Street baron, an executive, something, a Bay Street person. The finance minister in Canada for the last many years has been Chrystia Freeland. She's a former journalist. No background in having run a business, worked for a business. She covered business, but that's it.
You and I are current journalists. I would not argue that either of us is intrinsically qualified to be a finance minister.
To be anything other than what we're doing, and even some days not even qualified for that. So significant expertise in your portfolio is no longer required, and you could say, let's go further. Donald Trump's cabinet appointments are even further evidence of this, where the important prerequisites seem to be loyalty and appearing on Fox News a lot. I'm not saying that to be a smart aleck. It's just this is an empirically provable fact. Yeah. In fairness, given social media today, given the 24/7 cable news environment in which we live, you could argue that being a subject area expert or having a lot of experience in administration because these people are, after all, running departments in many cases with thousands or tens of thousands of employees, that's no longer as important as being famous and being a great communicator. And that is something the incoming president's cabinet choices all seem to have: fame and ample TV experience. So things have really changed, JMM.
You mentioned a few times there, that you use the word requirements, and I want to specify that it was like a presumption. It was not, I don't think, it was ever written down in law that the Attorney General had to be a lawyer. It was just a very long-standing convention. Same thing with like doctors and being the health minister, that kind of thing. And it's a natural sort of assumption that, particularly for these big, complicated files, you want somebody who at least has some familiarity with the area. These days, though, certainly for most of the 20th century and into the 21st, the subject matter experts, they aren't in the big chairs around the cabinet table. They're in the public service,
yes,
right? Deputy ministers, assistant deputies, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is actually a very good division of labor in a democracy, because it means that, as much as I joked earlier, right, like there's no formal reason why you or I could, or anybody listening or watching this podcast right now, right, you could go out, run for election. At least in theory, you could win a seat in the legislature, and the premier of the day could pick you to be a cabinet minister. And there's no formal bar to you serving in whatever capacity the premier would like you to. Mm-hmm. Voters can choose who they want in the legislature, and outside of the real edge cases of corruption or deep incompetence, that's a risk in a democracy, right? It's the public service that provides the expert advice on what is and is not a good policy idea.
Yeah. I mean, basically at the end of the day, you need competence, you need some judgment, you need some energy, and you have to have your heart in the right place. I mean, those are very important parts of the job. I say this, and again, this is not to be critical. This is just, the best example I can think of. The current Premier of Ontario was a businessman before he got into the Premier's chair, and one term on Toronto City Council as well. I'm pretty sure he did not have any understanding of how a bill becomes law before he became Premier of Ontario. He may have been the least prepared person to be Premier of Ontario of any of the 26 people who've had that job. And yet he's won back-to-back majority governments.
Yes.
And some would argue is well on his way to a third. So he clearly has some skills going for him that don't involve subject area expertise. So we put that on the record for what it's worth.
Absolutely. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on the show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the OnPoly podcast for this Friday, November 22nd, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
This is the part where I usually give special thanks to our wonderful crew for making the video podcast happen, and I want to do a very special shout out today.
Okay.
Because I think this is the last time, I'm getting a little verklempt even thinking about it. This is the last time that I'm going to be able to say Larry Curry's name on this program. Because Larry Curry, who got to this place before I did, and I've been here 32 years, and Larry was already here when I started. Larry is about to retire. Oh. I think this is the last show that we're all going to do together. And Larry, I want to, on behalf of everybody here, just tell you how absolutely glorious it has been working with you for more than 3 decades. Your nickname is Sparky, and we call you that because you are the spark around here. You keep it going. We love your competence. We love your sense of humor. We love your energy, and we are going to miss working with you. So, Larry, God bless and good luck with whatever comes next. You're the best. And until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
From online hoaxes to deep fakes, the media landscape is filled with misinformation and disinformation. Big, if true, is a new weekly series premiering on TVO, and it aims to help viewers navigate through the false narratives and fake news bombarding our feeds. It's hosted by journalist Molly Thomas, and she joins us now to tell us all about Big, if true.
You're nailing that.
I love to take the pause. Like the pause is important, don't you think?
The pause is important so we can think about it and,
Yeah.
and think, wait a second,
Yeah.
what is that about?
That would be big. If true.
true.
Exactly right. Exactly
You got it,
right.
you got it.
We got a fancy little promo we're going to show here first, okay? And then we're going to chat. Sheldon, if you would.
In a fractured information environment, isn't it hard to tell what's real and what's not? I'm Molly Thomas, host of a new show called Big If True. We'll look at everything from misinformation to disinformation, hoaxes to conspiracies, even outright lies. And don't worry, we'll help you cut through the noise. Debuting on November 24th at 8 p.m.
Cool. I can tell from that I'm exaggerating the pause a little bit. Maybe I don't have to pause so much.
I might have to learn a little from you because I was
Oh.
like, that pause is pretty good.
You like the pause?
I like the pause.
It's
I
an
like the
Edward R.
pause.
Murrow thing. He used to do this during World War II when he was covering it for CBS. He'd be on the rooftops in London and he would say, "This is London." So I ripped him off for that.
And everybody listened. And everyone
Very
listened.
true. Why are we doing this show, Molly?
Steve, think about your Twitter feed. Think about what you
Do I
see
have
on
to?
YouTube. You have to. Think about what's coming at you. When I'm looking even as a journalist, I started 15 years ago. Right now, I'm like, what is this? Who is this? Is something behind this? Is there funding behind this? It's changed the way that I interact. Social media has changed it. And I think people out there are really confused. There's a lot of chaos. And they're wondering, we have questions. And I think we should question things. We should ask in a critical way what's going on here. And so this is a show to open those doors and say it's okay to ask questions. Let's ask them. Let's find out what we can. Let's figure out the facts that we know. Let's figure out what we don't know and be comfortable doing that.
The timing of it seems very appropriate, right? Given everything going on in the world nowadays, the timing for a show like this feels right.
It is the right time. We just had a little election go down south of us, just a little one.
I heard something about that.
Yeah, it's happening. So yes, it is perfect timing, but not just, the U.S. election, which is our first episode is all about elections. We're talking about elections around the world. This was the biggest year for elections in history, both on a national, regional level. Nearly half the world voted, right? So people want to know what's real out there. They want to know what's not. They want to know what political deviance is going on behind the scenes that is not giving them the full information. And hopefully we have the experts in to come in and give us that background and set the stage for the other things at play with all the information we're seeing.
Speaking of background, can you tell us a bit about you? Because you are going to be new you and I have known each other for a while, but you are going to be new for some TVO viewers who aren't aware of your previous work. So tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for 15 years, ever curious. I love connecting with people, whether that's in the field or in the studio. And I deeply believe in public service journalism. So I just spent my last year working on the Michener, all about the loss of school for Afghan women and girls. And I felt very passionate about that because education has done so much for me. I'm sitting with you. I'm able to have a platform and speak about things because I had a chance to go to school and learn how to speak, how to think, how to question. And so many people, especially, Afghan girls, don't have that opportunity today because of what the Taliban has done. And so I spent my year really doing that. And so when this opportunity for TVO came up, I thought, what a cool opportunity to continue that education pathway, because this is also misinformation, disinformation. We're re-educating ourselves, all of us. Journalists are re-educating ourselves how to look at content, how to interact with this new world. And so hopefully that education thread is, kind of floated throughout my career, but I'm very passionate about it, and so I love what TVO does in that respect.
Give a shout out to your high school. Where'd you go to high school?
Oh, I'm from Luther College High School back in Saskatchewan. I'm a Regina girl originally, but as a journalist have lived in different parts of the country and spent times in different countries in the world bringing back stories. So yeah, I'm definitely from the 306, but Ontario has been home for 10 years, and I've loved it. I love Toronto.
I've just got the title for your memoir now. From the 306 to the 416.
There you go.
There we go.
There
that
we
works.
go.
From Saskatchewan to Ontario. We keep hearing these terms, and they're occasionally used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So maybe we should get you to explain the difference between misinformation and disinformation. What's the diff?
Yeah, and people, I think, are confused out there over those. So misinformation is, you see something online, seems credible, you spread it. You don't really think about it, you share it, you tell your friends about it, but it actually isn't true. But you're not doing it intentionally. Disinformation is I am maliciously trying to mislead you. And that is happening. And both of them are happening at the same time with the amount that we are on social media, the way that we're sharing content. Things are flying. The question is it true? That's what we're going to try to get to the bottom of.
I tell you, the best example of this I remember was back in the 2016 presidential election. So this is Trump versus Clinton. And I saw something come across my Facebook feed. It was an article from the Denver Bugle saying the Pope endorses Donald Trump for president. And I looked at it, and it looked like a very professional website.
Right.
And I thought to myself, like the Pope doesn't normally endorse a presidential candidate, but who knows, maybe he's making an exception in this case. And of course, you do 2 seconds worth of checking into it and you realize the whole thing's a hoax. There's no such thing as the Denver Bugle. Somebody's created a malicious website. The Pope doesn't endorse anybody. Of course he doesn't endorse anybody. But here we are. Now that experience is being replicated millions of times a day across our country, around the world. How is Molly Thomas going to get to the bottom of all of what's going on out there?
I'm so glad that I'm not doing it alone. Let me tell you, we have some amazing experts, Canadian experts that are diving into this misinformation and disinformation. We also have global experts that are going to be joining our show. And so these people are bringing their research. They're bringing their years of experience where they're just looking for patterns, trying to see, how campaigns that copy each other to purport disinformation. Like, people are looking into that. That's what the great thing about this is. We're going to bring them on. And then we also have a segment that's a little bit more interactive where we use, some of our producers, researchers on our shows to show us, how you at home might get tripped up over something. Is there a video? Is there a photo that seems a little suspect? And we will dig into it ourselves. So, just all of us need to relook at how we interact with information. Journalists too. I need to do it every single day. So it's a conversation I think we have to have both ways, and I think it's the time to be doing it.
How do we know we can trust you, Molly Thomas?
Oh, isn't that the question? Listen, I've been trying to build trust for 15 years, and I've had the privilege of bringing stories to this country, and I love what I do. So listen with a skeptical eye. Write us if you think something is off. Tell us. We want to know that because yes, we want to also see our own biases, our own. Maybe we missed something. It's important, but that's what I mean. It's a two-way conversation. We have to do this throughout the season.
This is, never mind timely. It's very important work, and people really need to. We need an uptick in our media literacy right now, right? Can I assume that part of your advice to people is before you want to share that story quickly with all of your friends because you think it's just so, delicious, maybe do 5 seconds of checking just to make sure that you're not part of the problem and that you are part of the solution? For
sure. But even in that checking, Steve, things have changed because you can find a lot of different articles that might support what you're saying. But what is behind those websites? Like it's a certain type of checking. And so hopefully with our interactive segment, we can start to help people maybe expand the types of fact-checking websites they're looking at. If I'm not quite sure and I have competing narratives, where else can I go? My hope is that we can all expand our media diet around websites that we can be thinking of. I'm learning new ones. I'm like, oh, cool, this is interesting, or this is looking at media bias, or looking at, bias in the way that our headlines are written. And we are examining and saying, okay, is this credible? Why is this credible? Would we give this space? It's just a constant conversation, and it's not going to stop because there's just going to be more and more coming at us. So, we might be around for a while.
Let's hope so. I hope so. If people want to watch this show, it airs on television when, and presumably is available online whenever, right?
That's right. This Sunday night coming up, 8 p.m. is our season debut, our first episode ever.
Fabulous.
And of course, you can find us on YouTube right at the same time. Everything is launching at the same time. So Big If True TVO, that is our social media handle for YouTube, Twitter. Where else are we? All that good stuff. You'll find us. Instagram, we're out there too. So Big If True TVO, find us, follow us, and be a part of the conversation.
And remember, the show is called Big If True. We love the pause. We love the pause. Molly, welcome to the family. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Kelton, let's just get you started right away, please. Why do you think the anti-monopoly project on this issue is such a big deal?
Well, I think a big part of why we wrote the report and why the organization exists is the fact that while some of these issues can be very front of mind, at the grocery aisle, they actually run much deeper in our economy. So what we wanted to do with this report is to recognize that, yes, there are competition issues at the grocery store, but those are also the byproduct of consolidation that runs much further up the chain that we need to take seriously.
Sylvain, can you give us a sense of how much consolidation there actually is in the food system in our country today?
Well, there's been lots across the food chain, from farm gate to plate. And in fact, all nodes of the supply chain have actually consolidated more because the other nodes have consolidated. But when you look at the grocery business in Canada over the last 30, 40 years, it's interesting that now we're asking for more competition when in actuality it was really an American invasion back in the 90s or 80s, 90s that actually led to the infrastructure we have today. So Walmart and Costco obviously have actually entered the Canadian market quite successfully, and that really pushed other players to consolidate, which is why we have just a few Canadian players now, Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro, because all three players have actually adjusted to a much more competitive landscape as a result.
Jennifer, I don't have to tell you, and I think anybody who's been following this story will know that, grocery store CEOs have been called to Parliament Hill to testify over high food prices. Some people have advocated boycotting various stores because of the consolidation. Where in the chain, as you look at it, does consolidation really begin?
Well, consolidation, as was already mentioned, is all through the agri-food supply chains, and it really begins in agricultural inputs, which are the seeds, the chemicals, the farm machinery, the fertilizers that farmers use in their fields and their agricultural operations, and that consolidation tracks through from that production level all the way through to the grain and commodity handling level, all the way through to food processing, and finally at retail.
How, in your view, have the Ukrainian people withstood so much bloodshed?
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Well, as you might have guessed by the visual, I'm sitting in the dark, as are probably millions of Ukrainians at the moment, because of the heavy pounding from Russian strikes on critical infrastructure in Ukraine. Odessa is a world port city, should be seen that way by the global community. Many countries, as you know, rely on the food that comes out of Odessa ports, but yet a small group of men in the Kremlin have been given free rein to decide what comes in and out of the port and how much of Ukrainian grain feeds the world. And they're also reported to be constraining trade in the in the Red Sea through the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. So, I think a lot of people here, it's fair to say, on this 1,000th day, a lot of people in Ukraine are saying, where is the global outrage? Where is the outrage when the Russians stop food going from Odessa, when they're pounding people into the dark ages, literally? So having said all that, especially in Odessa, which is historically an entrepreneurial city built by many different nationalities, there's what I've always called a irrepressible resilience. People go on no matter what, whether it's in terms of fighting or in terms of volunteer work, in terms of keeping their businesses going. But there is a weariness, a tiredness happening, and in a way that's going to put pressure on the Zelensky administration to find some way to end the war. And kind of to wrap up, I mean, no one here that I've met feels that any territory should be given up. They want everything to go back to 1991 lines. Whether that will happen at the negotiating table, we don't know. But it is fair to say also that a lot of worry what will happen in the next hours and days. Now that ATACMS are being used, what kind of response will that bring from the Russian side?
In which case, Maria, let me follow up with this. Is Ukraine, in your judgment, more vulnerable now than at any time since the war began? And if so, why do you believe so?
Yes, it's probably more vulnerable, in part because we have the Trump administration coming in about 8-10 weeks. And Trump, as you mentioned in the intro, has promised to settle this in a day. Now, he will find out that it is very, very difficult to settle this. First, because Putin has really not shown any realistic signs that he is ready to back off from the very maximalist gains, very maximalist goals that Russia has in this war, which is taking Ukrainian sovereignty. So we do speak a lot about what territory may be on the negotiating table, but I think we really need to remember that Russia is fighting this war not for territory, but to take Ukraine's sovereignty. And we're in a dangerous moment because it's not clear that the Trump administration understands that.
Timothy, how would you gauge Ukraine's vulnerability at this moment?
I think in a way it's a mistake for us to define it as Ukraine's vulnerability, because what's happened in the last 3 years or so is that Ukraine has taken all of our vulnerabilities upon itself. We forget that. We define Ukraine as a problem, when in fact Ukraine has been a solution. It's the Ukrainians who have been defending a rules-based world order. It's the Ukrainians who have been showing that nuclear blackmail doesn't have to work, and in that sense deterring nuclear proliferation. It's the Ukrainians who have been showing the Chinese how difficult offensive operations are, and thereby deterring them. It's the Ukrainians who have been fulfilling essentially the entire NATO mission all by themselves with a certain amount of assistance from their allies. All of those are things that the Ukrainians have done.
Chris, you first. We need the background here. 31 school boards, $200 million in the red. How?
Well, you'll hear the Ontario government say that funding is at historically high levels, which technically is true, but the funding has not kept up with inflation. And I think that's where school boards are really struggling right now. For some school boards, they pay higher wages to teachers than the average. So, that kind of deficit's already baked in for them. They've also seen some mandatory increases to Canada Pension, employment insurance. Like, these are things they have to pay, and they haven't been properly funded for. So, combined with the affordability crisis, which families are feeling the pinch, school boards are too. It's more expensive to heat schools and electricity and whatnot. So I think that's really why you're seeing a lot of boards this year in particular running into trouble.
Kathleen, you represent all the school boards across the province, so you got a good sense of what it looks like out there. What's going on?
I'm going to defer to what Chris just said. Funding has just not kept pace with our costs. We are, like households, we are trying to pay for things and services that we have to pay for, and we are not being funded enough. And it's a gap that has grown over time, and it's chronic.
Chronic.
Yeah.
Didn't start today.
It did not start today.
So this goes back.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's get to Nathan Shan on this one, because you represent one of the largest school boards on the whole continent. What's the situation in Toronto?
Well, it's the situation that is same, but amplified because of needs within City of Toronto. As you can see, OPSPA, Ontario Public School Board Association, has calculated about $800 per student underfunding, and some of the other organizations, including Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, have gotten it almost twice that amount. So even if you take the $800 per student, you're looking at a population of 235,000 students within City of Toronto, with 42,000 staff and 580 schools. So it's the large school board, and so we are facing the issue at a larger scale. But also City of Toronto, recently Social Planning Toronto released a report on child poverty within City of Toronto. So in addition to the regular flaws in the funding formula, we are also not being acknowledged for a city that is very complex and has a lot of socioeconomic needs and much more work to do. So over the years, as Kathleen mentioned, the chronic underfunding, each year we feel like we're cutting on a little bit, but over 2 decades, we've cut so much that we cannot recognize our schools when we go in. I'm going back to the schools I've been youth worker in 20 years ago. I was a student, and going back and seeing the kind of underfunding and what it means to a school. Like when you cut at a micro level, it's taking away a teacher makes a big impact in the school. Taking away caretaking hours makes a big impact in the school. So the money that's being cut may not be seen as proportionally high when we do it, but when you go into a grassroots level at a school level, it is impacting. So it is something that we need to fix quickly, and it's a fix that the province can do.
What makes concussions different from other kinds of injuries?
Well, it's an invisible injury because a lot of other brain injuries you could see if you did some imaging, but concussions we don't see. We have no way of making a diagnosis. It's a clinical diagnosis, and so you basically need a person to tell you something happened to them, and then they tell you about all the symptoms. And so you could imagine that that could be missed. Sometimes people don't want to tell you, or they don't realize how significant it is and don't report it. And there's also this idea that maybe these repetitive head injuries that don't actually give you all the concussion symptoms might also be something that we need to think about. So there's a lot of unknowns about concussion.
Tim, you played how many years in the CFL?
10 years.
10 seasons. How many blows to the head do you estimate you took?
Well, I think the data for football players shows that you take somewhere between 300 and 1,000 hits a year. And when you think, I was a soccer player as a kid, I played hockey, I played rugby year round. So it's very rare that I speak to anybody that's had less cumulative exposures than I did. That's the bad news. The good news is that so far I've been asymptomatic. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out is why are there former teammates of mine, friends of mine who are in our brain bank that had 1/10 of the cumulative exposures that I did.
And that is the agenda for Friday, November 22nd, 2024. Monday on the program, as the province and its capital city lock horns over bike lanes, we ask the question, does Doug Ford really want to be Premier of the 416? Ontario versus Toronto, next Monday. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday.